Hello and welcome to Frank's School, 113th day of the 6th year, first video. Hydra in my head, Prowls. Once again, that sounds sinister. Hydra lurked. Now Hydra prowls. Well, well, this isn't particularly happy. It's dangerous. The Inheritance War, as I referred to it, it went on for this time and basically was making the family miserable. Because it had kind of spoiled the thing we so much loved, our grandfather and this camp ranch. So that was going on. I wanted to mention too that success back then among some, I particularly think of my mother's sister Helen and her husband George, success was equal to getting out of town, leaving. Roaring Spring, where I was born, a little town near here, my sister Barbie lives there now. Roaring Spring was just this little town, and you couldn't really call yourself successful if you just stayed there. You had to get out into the bigger world. That was an ethic which I didn't relate to. I didn't understand that, and even when I finally came back and was substitute teaching, I tried to convince my students in a way that this was a good place. But, that's the way youth is sometimes. Well, there were cracks evident in my preparation, in my qualifications as a future upstanding citizen. The cracks had become evident, I think, when Hydra in my head was lurking. Now it's prowling. I wanted to mention the Admirable Crichton. There was a book, a play, which I would put it there with, say, The Hidden Persuaders, in that, it was just part of the curriculum, really. We read it. It affected me, though, because there was that idea. Once again, it was on an island, like Robinson, like Swiss Family Robinson for my dad, Mysterious Island for me. Here was another island book. But the guy, the hero of that, when they got marooned on the island, was the butler, because he could actually do things with his hands. So I wanted to mention that. I've often thought about that since. I may someday read it again, or it's been made into some movies. Now, this is the 60s. I'm thinking of myself basically in my college years. In the 60s, people associate that, the hippies and all that, with racial justice, the women's lib. These were going on, and I'm not trying by any means to say every single source of my thinking, but they're general. I mean, they were affecting everybody. I'm trying to think why it is that I got these different ideas and do things differently. Gay rights, environmental awareness, that's all fine. The war in Vietnam was there like this, how to even explain it? It was always there, worse than prowling. It was there, and here later on it became more apparent, but to some of us it was already apparent that our government, our country was doing something immoral and asking us to do something immoral. I mean, the 60s was rough in many ways. The sex and the drugs, I didn't, what they call free love and drugs, and I had too much of my dad's morality to get into either one of those particularly. So in a way, out of the 60s, if I was different there, it was in that these were not really part of my love, sure, but not that concept that people have the 60s, which I didn't even exactly know what was going on. Anyway, the 60s was going on, but during that time, I was coming to realize that I was not a destroyer. I was not going out and protesting. I was not taking part in all that kind of stuff. I was much more interested in what could be built. So you stop all this stuff. Well, then what do you do? So I kind of realized that about myself, and that kind of remains true. Well, I'd say it does remain true. All right, I was at Harvard for these 4 years. At Harvard, I was an English major by default. I had thought maybe anthropology, maybe German, maybe music. I think those were the three other possibilities, maybe English. And I took courses in the other ones and realized, no, not for me. So it was kind of English by default was my major. At a certain point, I was so miserable there in that city. I mean, all cities to me are dirty and horrible. But I thought about transferring to Cornell because I thought, well, I love farms and I love farming and stuff. And if I'm going to be an academic, well, maybe Cornell, that's the one to go to. But I got the information and I real seriously thought about just transferring out of Harvard to Cornell, but I didn't. Uh, Certain courses influenced me a lot. Economic botany, that profoundly affected me, and I've talked about it elsewhere. Eventually, I took a course when I was a senior in landscape architecture. Uh, Loved it. You know, there's this very much in the following of my mother's guiding, I think. When I decided that I would not try to honor in English, I remember that my advisor at the time, he said, well, that will end your career in English. I said, so be it. I'm not going to do it. I was not going to write a thesis. I was not going to so limit myself to the subjects around English, not when there was all that other stuff to be learning there. So I did not do that, although which was one of the reasons I was able to take things like economic botany and landscape architecture. I was freed up from all the requirements of that. And oral tradition was something too that it was a discovery for me. That's basically when I sometimes talk about words or reading and writing are overrated. I don't have time to go into that now, but that whole subject of the oral tradition, they were influences that pertain still. So they were there. And, you know, I got a good education, which then served me well for actually making my living for about 25 years then afterward. My roommate, Lee Alexander, boy, I should not leave him out. I got thinking about that. He's dead now. He was killed in an accident on a motorcycle. But there were four of us, Alexander or Lee and two others, that stayed together for the whole 4 years. My roommates were a very bright part of my experience in college. Lee Alexander. Anyway, he maybe had some of that same split. He talked me into, or at least he and I together, while we were freshmen, took a course in auto mechanics at a local high school. We had to walk down the street to do it. So, you know, I wanted to know two things I thought that a person really should know is they ought to know about a car and they ought to know about a house if they're going to be in any way sort of independent. So anyway, he and I did that. He introduced me to the idea of riding a motorcycle and driving. He bought one, or we bought one together. I think it was him. I think he was the guy that got me, or I think together we hired on as night watchmen, so we actually could earn a little bit of money. And for about a year and a half, while I was at Harvard, I was working 40 hours a week as a night watchman. I could do my studying while I was being the night watchman. Of course, I had to be awake from like midnight till 8. But anyway, that was his idea, and in that process, I met a guy named Joe York, who was a gangster, really, a very dangerous man. He was the maintenance man that was on the night shift, and he and I would share coffee about 1 a.m. or 1:30 a.m. and I would listen to his stories. And the thing about Joe, as I say, he was a gangster. He was a what do you call it, pickup man for the numbers racket, which was illegal in Massachusetts, gambling. But he was a storyteller. And he was more of a poet and had more of a gift for language than any of the professors at Harvard. He was way above them, and that kind of impressed me. Lee also introduced me to hitchhiking. I started to hitchhike back and forth to get home to see my girlfriend in Concord, New Hampshire. And one summer then, I actually devoted the summer to hitchhiking around the United States, kept a journal, called it Summer School. These are things where he influenced me. He got me into boxing. He talked me into doing intramural boxing at Harvard. So he was a big influencer. But anyway, I wrote down truck driver because I remember at a certain point I was so miserable in that world that I thought, why don't I just become a truck driver? Because then my mind can be fairly free, and I think I might have been idealizing the life of a truck driver, but I seriously thought about doing that because this was such a miserable time for me. All right, on we go.